Hi, Campinos, welcome back. You are in Foundational Anatomy Part 6, the cardiovascular system. So we have walked ourselves through basic anatomy, the musculoskeletal system, the respiratory system, the nervous system, endocrine system, and now we are checking out what's happening in the cardiovascular system. This portion is not going to be super detailed or intense. We're just going to talk about the basics. What is the cardiovascular system? What's its function? And then what are the parts? And then we'll spend a little time on another video and something called heart rate variability, because it is sort of a applicable principle to our yogic practices and how the yogic practices help with this thing called heart rate variability, which helps with overall health, well-being, and longevity of life. So let's jump in at the beginning, and we'll get to our notes here. So here is the cool cardiovascular system. So this picture here just depicts the system inside of the skeletal system, and you can see these red and blue lines, if you will. So when we were looking at the nervous system, we saw a bunch of yellow lines representing the nerves. Well, these red and blue lines are representing the arteries and the veins. And we'll go over here to this other picture, which is the cardiovascular system without the bony structure. So you can see here in the center is the heart. And you can see it's sort of central in the body, but it hangs more towards the left-hand side of the body. And then you can see coming off of the heart and coming into the heart from the upper portion, the superior portion, the inferior portion, these larger vesicles, if you will, in blue and red, as well as these down here. And you can see they make their way down. And actually the red makes its way down, the blue makes its way up, and it gives off many branches as it moves through the body. And you can see it will just scroll all the way down the vasculature as it comes down into the legs. And then also the vasculature here that comes out of the inferior portion or superior portion of the heart, as well as the comes into the inferior portion of the heart, working through the upper body here and the limbs and the arms, as well as the head. Now, you'll get to know some of the names of these vesicles, but you don't need to know all of it. And we're going to talk about the flow and how the blood flows through the body. Again, nothing that you need to necessarily memorize. It's just good information to be aware of. So what is the cardiovascular system? Well, the cardiovascular system, the circulatory system, is the system of the body that allows for transport of blood, waste products, and immune cells. So I think that's a really important piece, especially these last year. Like, I think many of us know when we think of the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system, we've got blood flowing, right? Well, we also have waste products that need to be processed and released. They need to be taken to the right places so that they're excreted. And then we also have, this is the place where our immune cells roam around so that they can go to the right places in the body to help maintain our immune function. So what does the cardiovascular system do? Well, it transports nutrients, oxygen, and hormones to cells throughout the body. It removes metabolic wastes, so carbon dioxide, we've talked about that, and also nitrogenous waste, which comes usually from the product of the end product of food that we eat and consume. Protection of the body by the immune system, which includes the white blood cells, the antibodies, and complement proteins, nothing of which you need to memorize. And defense against that allow us to defend against foreign microbes and toxins. There's also protection mechanisms that happen through clotting factors that are found in the blood. So that if you have a cut that is, any size cut, honestly, but particularly ones that are rather large, where you could have significant blood loss. So you want the body to quickly clot in those areas so that the blood doesn't, the blood loss doesn't equate to an emergent situation where you would need to be treated. And then we have, it also helps with regulation of the body temperature, fluid pH, and the water contents of cells. So what are the parts? Well, I got to be honest, you guys, it's pretty easy. There's not a lot we're going to have to know. So one of the main big organs of this system is the heart. So let's just take a peek at the heart here from the external surfaces. And just we'll just hit on a couple of things that I think are important for you to know. So this organism, this organ is here's the organ, this is the heart. And then these red and blue things are vasculature coming into and off of the heart. So the heart is this sort of roundish triangular shape, right? You can see why so when we draw a heart, we kind of create this outline of our actual heart. This is known as the apex. So this is the bottom of the heart. And then this is the upper portion of the heart. Oftentimes when you're listening to the heart, you'll listen at the apex and at several other places here. Now, when we go to the cross section of the heart and look inside, it'll make more sense, but there are four major areas of the heart that I do want you to be aware of. So the first one is called the right atrium. The second is the right ventricle. The third here is the left atrium. And the fourth is the left ventricle. Now, the ventricles, really, these are hard to visualize from the external surface. Like I said, when we go through the cross section, we look inside, you'll see the ventricles, you'll see these areas. The outside here, there are two important, well, really, there's a couple important pieces, but one I want you to know too. So this is called the left coronary artery, this red structure that runs down on the left-hand side of the heart. And this is one of the coronary arteries. When we talk about coronary arteries, these are the arteries that tend to, when you have high cholesterol, these arteries are very susceptible. And in particular, the left coronary artery, if you have a high cholesterol and plaque development inside of the artery can stop appropriately perfusing the heart, which can then lead to a heart attack. This is oftentimes referred to, it's sort of, it's not great, but it's called the widowmaker. And I don't mean that to be triggering, but this is the one where if you have a heart attack and this is this is where your blockage is, oftentimes heart attacks can be quite fatal in here. So we really want to ensure clean arteries through here. And then you also have subsequently the right coronary artery as well. And then the other two things I want you to really be aware of are the vasculature. So the blue piece here. So when you see blue, blue typically means it's a vein, and a vein carries deoxygenated blood, and we'll visit that in just a second. And so coming into the heart from the superior portion is the superior vena cava, right here. And then this is the right pulmonary artery. Now, this language is a little confusing when it comes to the pulmonary, and we'll talk about the blood flow in the heart and you'll understand why. So this artery is actually, it's not deoxygenated, it's deoxygenated blood rather than oxygenated blood. And then this is the inferior vena cava. So this is the coming up from the bottom portion of the body, feeding into the heart. So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava dump the deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. And then you have here what we call the pulmonary trunk. And then the pulmonary trunk divides into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Again, we'll go through this in more detail when we talk about the blood flow. And then you have here, this red colored vessel is what many of you have heard of is the aorta. So we kind of divide the aorta into some different parts. So we call the piece coming up out of the heart called the ascending aorta right here. And then you come around and you have the aortic arch. And then what you can't see is that the aorta then dives down back behind the heart and then travels down, just like the inferior vena cava. It follows right next to it down through the body. And that's called the descending aorta. And here on the aortic arch, you have these three different arteries. You have the left subclavian, the left common carotid, and the brachiocephalic trunk. These arteries are responsible for taking blood flow up to the head, up to the heart. And then you have here the pulmonary veins. And you can see when I tell you veins are typically blue and arteries are typically denoted as red, the pulmonary veins and arteries are flipped around, and that will make good sense when we talk about blood flow. So that's the outside of the heart. So now let's go peek at the inside of the heart. So this is the cross section. So we've cut the heart in half. And now we're looking at it. So here is our superior vena cava. Here's the inferior vena cava. That brings and dumps blood into here. Here's the right atrium. So it's the upper portion of the right hand of this side. So this chamber here. And then here down here, this is called the tricuspid valve. So the valve that sits between the right atrium, and then this is the right ventricle down here. And there you can see this is called the tricuspid valve because there's 1, 2, 3, essentially 3 little cusps that create this tricuspid valve, if you will. And then you have here's our pulmonary artery, pulmonary trunk, and it has the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. And then you have your pulmonary veins. So here's the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary veins. And you notice the colors switched here. Again, this will make sense when we talk about blood flow. The pulmonary veins here feed into the left ventricle, the left atrium. The left atrium then filters through what we call the aortic valve. And the aortic valve allows the blood to come into the left ventricle here. And then from the left ventricle here, we go through here to the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta. And then you can see here, this is the musculature that is on the inside of the heart. And this is really important, this musculature here. This is called the cardiac muscle. Remember, we have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and then skeletal muscle. So this cardiac muscle is very specialized musculature that works specifically to pump the blood through the heart. And I think that's really all that you need to know in terms of just sort of the basics of the heart. So that's the external, internal. Now, the other parts of the circulatory system, as you've already seen, are the blood vessels, right? So typically arteries carry blood that's oxygenated away from the heart, and veins carry blood that's deoxygenated or has more carbon dioxide to the heart. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in the body, and they connect the smallest arteries to the smallest veins. That's where we make this transition between arteries and veins. The capillaries sit in between. And again, you see here the exception is the nomenclature with pulmonary circulation. Again, this will make sense in just a few moments. So let's just take a peek here at this diagram. So this is the artery. So we see here it's indicating that blood is coming from the heart through the arteries. The arteries filter into smaller and smaller arteries, and then eventually they turn into capillaries. So here's the capillary. We usually call these capillary networks because they're just sort of this diffuse network of blood vessels that surrounds the tissues of the body. And at the mid-range point in the capillary network, you start to have this transition because usually this is where things are happening, where the oxygen is getting dropped off to the particular cell or the particular organ, whatever it might be. And then that organ or cell is letting go of the carbon dioxide and the byproducts, as well as also some other additional byproducts of metabolism. And it's then picking those up through these capillary exchange, just like when we talked about the capillaries in the alveoli in the respiratory system, right? So now we have deoxygenated blood because we've dropped the oxygen enough. We've picked up that carbon dioxide. and waste products. And now the blood starts to circulate back through these small venules, and eventually the venules become bigger and bigger into veins, and they take that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And then what the heart does is allows for the pumping of the deoxygenated blood through the lungs so that we can go through and reoxygenate it in the lungs, in the alveoli, which you already know about. So let's talk now specifically about the pathway of the blood. So we have, let's start with oxygenated blood pumped out. So the oxygenation, the blood that's oxygenated, that's this nice red full of oxygen, gets pumped out of the left ventricle here, and we'll end at the left ventricle. So here is the left ventricle and the blood gets pumped out and it goes through the aorta, and it says, okay, I'm going to take some of this blood, I've got to draw the blood up through the neck and through the head. And I also need to take the blood to the upper body, right? So through the arms and the pectoral girdle, as well as some other places in the upper body. And then it flows down through the descending aorta. And as it goes down through the descending aorta, the aorta starts to branch off and perfuse the rest of the thorax and the lower portion of the body. Then, once it's done all of that, it circulates around to the bottom of the body, right? So down at the lower level or wherever it's making the transition from going to where it needed to go, and then dumping the oxygen off into those spaces and then picking it up. Doesn't have to be from the lower portion of the body, it could be from the thorax too. Anyway, it joins back at the inferior vena cava, the lower half of the body. And then what happens is that blood that's circulating through the upper portion of the body dumps back in to these, the left and the right jugular vein, as well as the subclavian vein. And we have the right pulmonary artery. This is going to get a little confusing, and I don't want to confuse you. But so essentially, we have a place where the blood comes back from the upper portion of the body, and a place where the blood comes back from the lower portion of the body, and they really dump into, ultimately, the superior vena cava is from the upper portion of the body, and the inferior vena cava from the lower portion of the body. So now we have deoxygenated blood. So here we go. So in comes the blood, and this deoxygenated blood drops into the right-hand side of the heart, so into the right atrium. Then the heart does a little beat, and what happens is that little beat allows for the valve here to open. So in between the beat, actually, the valve opens, drops the blood into the right ventricle. There's the pulse, right? The heartbeat, and that pulse pumps the blood out from the right ventricle into what we're calling the left and right pulmonary arteries. Now, remember, arteries take blood away from the heart. Typically, they're taking oxygenated blood away, but in this case, this is the deoxygenated blood, but it's taken away from the heart, which is why we call these the left and right pulmonary artery. Even though the blood is deoxygenated, it's still taking blood away. Okay, so the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery now feed into the lungs. So pulmonary means lungs, and that's what we saw when we were in the respiratory system. Then happens, the blood circulates through the circulatory system within the lung tissue. You are breathing in the oxygen, and the alveoli, in comes the oxygen, here comes the deoxygenated blood through that capillary system. The carbon dioxide gets offloaded back to the alveoli, the oxygen comes in to now what they're going to call veins, and the pulmonary, left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins take this new oxygenated blood and bring it back to the heart. So veins take blood to the heart, which is why these are, even though they're oxygenated, they're called veins. So now the left pulmonary vein and the right pulmonary vein come back. We've got some new oxygenated blood because we've taken a big deep breath, right? And in comes the blood into the left atrium. So we have oxygenated blood in the left atrium. The heart has a little rest. Down the blood goes into the left ventricle. Pumps, it contracts or beats, and that left ventricle, and you can, it's hard in this schematic actually, they have it even, but the left ventricle, and I'll show you again, has a thicker musculature development on the left-hand side to push forcefully this oxygenated blood up out into the aorta, which is where we started. Remember, we started here. So now we have this beautiful oxygenated blood into the aorta, and off it goes to the upper portion of the body, and down it goes to the lower portion of the body. And then the whole system starts over again in the oxygenated blood into the vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary arteries, exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen in through the pulmonary veins, dumps into the left. We now have oxygenated blood dumping into the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, pumps out the oxygenated blood through the aorta. Woo! Did we get all that? It's pretty intense, right? But it's kind of cool. So now you know how the blood flows through the heart. And it's really important that blood flows in that way. And we want our heart to have that nice, strong, contractile muscle and contraction so that we can get the blood to move up, out, and where it needs to go, right? All right. So let's go back here and finish. This is just another diagram. You can take a peek at that here. It labels, it sort of has this nice label, just everything we did here. It walks you through. Here's the lungs. And now as we've got it oxygenated, we go back and it sort of follows through here in this more schematic. Oh, let's just take a peek here at, you can see here, see the musculature here on the left-hand side. Do you see how it's thicker than the right-hand side, right? Because in theory, the right-hand side doesn't, we don't have to make the blood, like we don't need this super overly forceful contraction because the heart and the lungs are really close together. You just need the blood pulsed out so it can start that movement through the lungs. But here we need a real nice hefty contraction. So the muscle is stronger, the myocardium is what we call it, is stronger here to really help to force the blood up out through the aorta and the aortic arch. Cool. Okay. So the last parts of the blood or the circulatory system are the blood. And the blood consists of a couple of different things. So we'll just take a look at those different constituents. The thing you're most familiar with are red blood cells, right? So red blood cells are what carry our oxygen in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So I briefly touched on that in the respiratory system. We have hemoglobin inside of here, and the hemoglobin is where the oxygen attaches. This has to do with iron. This is why iron is really important in our diet. We won't go any further than that, but just you can know that. The other thing you might be familiar with are white blood cells. So white blood cells, there are several different types of white blood cells, and these are what are responsible for our immune system, our immunity. They fight diseases and help us to recover from infection. And then you have what we call platelets. Those are the clotting factors. So you need a good amount of platelets to help clot the blood so that you don't continue to bleed inappropriately. Now, there are some disease states associated with all three of these different types of constituents in the blood that can cause some, real serious complications. And then the last part, the majority of our blood is actually made up of what we call plasma. So plasma is this sort of it happens to be this yellowish liquid. I don't know if it ever happened to seen a vial of blood after they spin it down and separate it. It will look like this. The collection of things, the RBCs, WBCs, and platelets fall to the bottom because they're heavier. And then you have this plasma here, which is mostly water, but it has some substances in it. So we have like nutrients, salts, proteins, and hormones. And the plasma helps to transport additional substances that are not the red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets throughout the body, right? So the nutrients that we need, the hormones we need, and then the byproducts of metabolism, the waste products that we need transported. So that's it. I think this is just a nice another picture here of the cardiovascular system separating the venous system from the arterial system, and then the diagram of the circulation, as well as the structure of the heart. So you can peek at that in your notes. So we're going to end this video here, and then we'll pop into a second video and talk just briefly about this concept of heart rate variability. So in this video, we reviewed what the cardiovascular system was, what it does, and what the parts are of it, and how the blood flows through the cardiovascular system and the constituents of blood, and why that's important. So I'll see you in the next video.